you've got a fairly illustrious and full career in the space industry. A real rocket scientist, actually. You're probably my first proper rocket scientist that I've chatted to. How did you get started in space and aeronautics?
I got started in space, I think, when I was a child. I'm of a sufficient age that I'm what they call one of the children of Apollo. I was 9 years old when Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon. I remember we were on a summer vacation at the time, so we didn't have a television. We just had to listen to it on a transistor radio. My dad waking me up and making me listen to it. And of course, at that point, it didn't mean like a great deal because there weren't any pictures except the ones in my head. But then the next time I actually saw the moon in the sky and thought, yeah, there's people up there, that had a big impact on me. And yeah, then when I was a teenager, I joined the local astronomy society. I got involved with the British Interplanetary Society back then. Read lots of science fiction. I'm a bit of a geek that way. Came across Jerry O'Neill's idea for the high frontier. I was a member of the L5 Society for a while, when there was such a thing as the L5 Society, before the US National Space Society. Knew that I wanted to do something connected with space, so was advised to do a physics degree as a good sort of general purpose starting point. So I did that. And then afterwards, I did a master's in space physics. I worked at what was then the University of Kent at Canterbury in the Unit for Space Sciences on some space missions. By that time, I guess you could say I was a kind of early career space scientist. And I came to realize that although I quite enjoyed the science, I was also, quite interested in the machinery that went there. I'd like to go there myself if I could.
So you would actually like to go up to space?
Oh yes, yeah, no, absolutely, I'd love to. So then I swapped tracks a little bit. I then became a PhD student at Cranfield University and did a PhD in spacecraft engineering. And then after that, went into academia and did all sorts of stuff. And back round about then, there was a thing called the Juno program in the UK. Helen Sharman ultimately flew to the Mir space station on that, but I applied to that and I got to somewhere round about candidate 25 before being ejected on the grounds of insufficiently high quality nostrils. Apparently on this side where the hole in the skull is that the nostril goes through, it's smaller on this side than on this side, which was detected by a skull x-ray, and that has had some effect on the sinuses. And that was me gone.
So that was it. That was it. Wow, that's fairly harsh. So that's a bit like being 25th in line to the throne. It's very nice being there, but it's never going to happen.
Oh yeah, no, that was something. Whenever that was, 25 plus years ago, and it was a bit fun at the time. Okay, and I remember I had a friend who would introduce me at parties as, oh, meet Chris. He was almost an astronaut, which for maybe a year or two after was okay, but when they did it 5 years later on, I said, I think we can firmly establish that part of my career, space is over, and there are other things. I've seen similar things both in the space world and the non-space world. You go and see a band that you've been following for 30 years or something, and they want to play their new album. And of course, all the fans are going, no, play this one. But they're going,
the old stuff.
We've done that, yeah. And I had the same conversation with one or two Apollo astronauts, but I think it also applies to some astronauts as well. Which is, I know one of the Apollo moonwalk, I won't mention which one, but he said to me, there is a problem because if what you're known for is something that you did 30 years ago. Yeah. And that's the defining moment in your life, then what do you do with the rest of your life? If that's all that anybody ever wants to talk to you about, they're not interested in anything you've done since then. It's just what did you do 30 years ago or 50 years ago? He says that could be a bit of a downer.
Interesting.
And he said, so I have to manage it. He said, I'm not going to gainsay it. It was a massive event in my life and it had all sorts of effects, but I can't be defined purely by something that happened that long ago. Yeah. And I've seen that happen with other astronauts, particularly astronauts for countries where they've only had one astronaut and that astronaut won't get to fly again. Again, I'm thinking of some examples, no names, no pack drill, where the person in question is that country's astronaut forever and ever, and any time there's anything to do with space, they get called upon, and it's after a while. I think it becomes a bit of an imposition,
Yeah, I bet.
What happens if you want to move to another country to pursue your career? No, you can't, because we have to have you here because you're our astronaut.
You're a national treasure in this country.
Yeah, exactly. I think with time, this sort of thing will change. We're seeing the commercialization of space. Okay, I know there are a lot of arguments about whether Richard Branson, is an astronaut. Jeff Bezos and his group are astronauts, defined by whether they went past the von Karman line or not.
Past the Karman line.
And it's interesting to see that there's an organization called the Association of Space Explorers, which is basically an astronaut club. And they have recently agreed, I think it was launched about a year ago, sort of little lapel badges for astronauts to wear. And there's two different designs, one for orbital astronauts and one for suborbital astronauts.
Okay.
Because, of course, if we go on being as successful in sending people into space, in due course, the kind of iconic hero cachet of being an astronaut, it'll be something more, I'm an airline pilot, or you go, oh, okay, that's nice. Or I work on an aircraft, I'm not even a pilot, I'm a flight engineer, or I manage the cargo.
Yeah, but all those roles will be required as we move into space. But when you first got involved, your cohort of people that you would be mixing with were all involved in space. So this is probably a slightly difficult question to ask you, but I'm curious as to whether the general population was as aware of space as they are now, or do you think there's an increasing awareness in space at the moment? Are we getting to the point where people actually understand what's going on?
It's gone through waves. Back in the 1960s and early 70s, the first era of space exploration, humans went into space, humans went to the moon, we started sending spacecraft to other planets. It was all completely new and very exciting, and so a lot of people were aware of it. They may or may not have supported it. Some people would see sending things into space as a waste of money. I, of course, would disagree quite vehemently. But at least there was a sort of awareness. And then, I guess, during mid to late 70s and onwards, for some years, it went into a dip. There wasn't a great deal new happening. We had the space shuttle kind of launch, and that, for people who were interested, attracted attention. And we were going on doing, missions to Mars with moderate degrees of success, depending on the mission. But there really wasn't the same, it wasn't seen to be cool in quite the same way as it had been in the 60s. And now it's very much taken off again over the last 10 years, I would say, maybe a bit longer than that. Partly, obviously because of the activities of people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who are my sort of age, but instead of becoming academics, they decided to become very rich. I guess Jeff Bezos is closer to my age than Elon Musk, but he was very interested in space. He was a space enthusiast student, but decided he was going to make money and then, spend it on having a space company. Maybe I should have gone down that route, but there we go, a bit late now. And so that started attracting attention, and then Elon Musk. And then at the same time, there was this phenomenon that started in the US of what was called new space, which is now not so very new. But it's old space, if you like, was a kind of function of the classic, what they call military-industrial complex, the relationship between government and big aerospace companies, who have a synergy between them. The government needs the aerospace companies to deliver these big projects, and the companies need the government to give them the money for these big projects, which were usually executed under the terms of what was called cost plus, which means it's whatever it costs plus an amount on top, which is great. It must be very nice to get paid a contract like that, because you've got no incentive to try and keep costs down, whatever it costs. And the government's got deep pockets. Whereas new space was the opposite. It was very much low cost space in relative terms, very entrepreneurial, heavily influenced by the attitude to software development and that side of things in Silicon Valley. And I remember having a sort of an eye-opening moment at one point when I was talking to an American space investor who had started out actually in medical technology and in making it. And he explained how it's the first time I ever heard the phrase minimum viable product. He says you make the smallest, cheapest thing you can and you get it out there and you sell it so you can make money to develop it. And the same happens with software. Whereas traditionally in space, the attitude had been it's really difficult and really expensive to get to space. So we have to make everything as reliable as possible, because if anything goes wrong, we can't fix it. And so, you had these enormously expensive undertakings. And New Space tried to change that and bring this Silicon Valley mindset to it. Helped at the same time by the development of very small satellite designs, which initially couldn't do very much, but as technology has increased, they've been able to do more and more. And then that led to a blossoming of space startups of all sorts, initially in the satellite field, using satellite applications and satellite data. Then for launch companies, again, one of the painful parts of my teenage years, shall we say, is when Britain, cancelled its space launch capability. I think probably still the only country in the world to have ever developed a launcher and then walked away from it. Now, things are obviously very different in the UK, but now there are so many new launcher companies, new satellite companies, new satellite application companies. I used to know all the space companies in Europe because there are only, 5 to 10 of them or something, depending on how much they've merged. And now every day there's a new space company starting up with a new idea. Clearly, not all of them can be successful, but we don't need all of them to be successful. In the same way, we don't need all software companies to be successful. We just need some of them to be successful. And I think as part of that and the money involved, people have started to view space a little differently. There is still this classic idea about space is expensive, and as people in the space community are fond of saying, people seem to think we put the money into a rocket and launch it into space. It's gone. They don't understand the rocket goes to space, but the money stays on the ground, and it goes to pay for people's jobs and support the economy and develop new business. And that's been one of the things in the space domain that basically, despite the kind of economic downturn, investment in space has continued to return benefits. I'm based in France now. I've been here for about 11 years. But one of the last things I was involved in before I left the UK was an initiative by industry and academia, but supported by part of the government, to demonstrate this fact, to try and explain to government the value of space in all its different forms. And blow me down, we were successful. Normally when one talks to governments and gives them reports, one's a bit sanguine about it. One's done one's best, but one doesn't expect them to necessarily respond. But actually the UK government did respond, and has been supporting space and developing space, and wants to reposition the UK in the global space market. And again, you go down near Oxford, around Culham and Harwell, or you go up to Leicester and up in Scotland. There are loads and loads of small space companies getting to become bigger space companies, building satellites, and in 6 to 8 weeks, we'll see hopefully satellites launched by Virgin Orbit from Cornwall. Right. And then more launch pads in the north of the country, and so launching satellites from the UK will be seen as normal.
But and I haven't really been involved in researching too much about space for very long, but as I talk to people, almost nobody that I talk to in my reasonably large network of business people has any perception and concept of what's going on in the space industry. But when you start peeling the onion back and actually doing some research in the space industry, you understand quite how big it is. And it is, to me, it's a little surprising that either people have quite an extensive knowledge or almost no knowledge and no understanding that the amount of work that's going on and the amount of money, the amount of research. And the thing that really interests me, Chris, is the amount of earthbound applications that come out of what we're doing in space.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two aspects to that, because yeah, in the space community, we sometimes talk about two sorts of activities: those that look out and those that look back. Those which are, you know, scientific, exploratory, looking out into the universe, going out in the universe, and those that look back at the Earth and provide services for people on Earth. And certainly at the moment, the commercial benefits really all for those services that look back. Whereas when people tend to think of space, what they tend to think of is human beings on the moon or that sort of thing. And so they're both part of the space activity, but they're different things. And flying to the moon or Mars, yes, woo, that's exciting for members of the general public, shall we say. The intricacies of the delivering of the timing signals for cell phone towers, so that when we move from cell to cell as we travel, that our phone goes on working. It's absolutely crucial, but most people won't get terribly excited by that, even if you tell them, yeah, the timing signal for that comes from satellites, and if those satellites weren't there, the mobile phone network would stop working, because all the towers would think it was a different time, and you wouldn't be able to get that handover. But it's like many aspects of technology. Science comes along, somebody comes up with a new principle of science, somebody works out how to apply it in the technology and then in a way to make money, and it becomes embedded and invisible almost, or taken for granted unless people stop and think. The delivery of fresh water, you know, to my house, so I can just walk out the room, turn it on, and clean fresh water comes out, and I don't need to worry about finding a stream or purify. That's, yeah, pretty amazing too. It's just I've grown up with it, and so I'm the same with, you know, electricity in houses, and people just get used to whatever the current situation is, and don't think about it. My mobile phone, when I was a teenager, I would have considered this wonderfully science fiction device. The fact that you and I are using computers, but we could do this over phones. We could have a video call from one person to another, you know, from one part of the world to another. And we accept that now. And actually, it's amazing. The technology makes miraculous things boring. That's what happens. And so all these miraculous space applications, precision location using GPS for farmers, being told where the traffic is as you're trying to navigate as you drive, or communications, weather forecasts, all those sort of things are just taken for granted. They're under the surface. And same as when you drive a car, unless you're particularly interested in cars, you don't stop to think what's under the bonnet until it goes wrong. And there will always be people who are interested in what's under the bonnet, but most people won't be.
So of all the many things that are going on at the moment, what's captured your imagination and you're kind of most excited about seeing how that plays out over the next year or two?
I think on the big stage, honestly, I think it has to be SpaceX Starship. You know, whether you think Elon Musk is a visionary, or whether you think he's a rich guy with too many toys, people can argue about that. But I think you can't argue about, you know, what he's achieved with SpaceX in terms of developing the company. And Starship, if all goes to plan, whatever the timeline is suddenly going to enable the delivery of incredibly large payloads to space, whether to orbit or possibly to the moon. Yeah. And since the big bottleneck, the big constraint on doing things in space has always been getting things up there, anything that lowers the cost per kilogram will make things easier, because in the past you had to make these things ultra reliable and small and light, which means expensive. If you can get something up there cheaply, in inverted commas, then, you know, the development of your widget, whatever it is, doesn't need to be so expensive. And if it goes wrong, it doesn't matter, because you can send another one. And I think that has the prospect to transform how a lot of things happen in space. Some people have started thinking about this, but I think a lot of people haven't. And then obviously there's the question whether Starship gets used to land on the moon and then go on to Mars. If it achieves even half of its potential, that's going to be fairly... Of course, companies like Blue Origin and others are working on big rockets as well. It has to be said that SpaceX is making the pace at the moment. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever quite believes the timelines that Elon quotes in public when he says, we'll do this by then. But I would say, based on what he's achieved so far, nobody doubts that he will, achieve some significant breakthroughs.
So what do you think is the right approach? Do you think you're building a moon base or leaving things in orbit and then going from there onto Mars, if that's the plan?
Historically, I've always been, I would say, a more evolutionary approach guy than a kind of big bang guy, because it's always been so difficult to get to space. I would say go to low Earth orbit, get things sorted in low Earth orbit, start to expand capabilities, get yourself to the moon, and then move out beyond that.
Yeah.
But of course that depends on your capabilities. If you've got the capability to do big ambitious missions all in one go, it's a bit like saying, I've built a Ferrari and now I'm going to drive it down the street at, first of all, 5 miles an hour for a few years, and then I'll maybe go up to 10 miles an hour. And if you've got a Ferrari, you can do that, certainly, and driving it slowly in a city is probably a good idea. But if you want to get to another city, you could just go. That said, I have concerns about the ideas about what's going to happen when you get to Mars. I'm not at all sure that Mars colonization, or settlement as is the better term nowadays, or even on the moon, is going to be as easy for humans as people may think. I'm more concerned about Mars if the idea is you send people to a planet where you haven't even brought back a sample of the rocks yet. But obviously you could go there and send some people and bring the rocks back, I guess. Because there's a lot of environmental problems. But for example, dust, both on the moon and Mars, in slightly different ways. It's tricksy stuff. It's very small and quite sharp. I have concerns that the existing filtration systems wouldn't be good enough, and if you have people going out on the surface and then coming back in, even if they're going through an airlock, I think it could be bad for mechanisms. I think you could see maybe something a bit like silicosis or miner's lung, where people have inhaled this stuff, and honestly we don't know. Now some people would say that's fine if people are prepared to go and take the risk, that's down to them, and possibly that's true, possibly that isn't. That's an ethical argument, and I have no idea how you actually decide the right answer to that.
Yeah, I think there will always be explorers. There always has been explorers, but and then after explorers come settlers. There's a cohort of the human population that will volunteer and want to go to these places, and then discover whether it was a good idea or not. But throughout history, there's always been people that are prepared to jump in the ships and see what happens. I
guess that's a matter of kind of informed understanding, because I agree with you. And if somebody said to me, Chris, would you like to go to Mars? You've got a 50-50 chance of surviving it, and you can't come back. I'm old enough now to think that would be a way to go out. What would you do then? Would you go? I'd have to give it some thought, but I would certainly give it some thought. I'd have to have a discussion with the family and all that. But yeah, I would certainly be tempted to just because my entire life has been focused around this emotional desire to get off the planet. And even if all I could do was a Jeff Bezos there and back in 20 minutes sort of flight, that would be good. But to actually go to another planet would be a good way to conclude one's life, I think. It depends on the relative risk levels and all that. But as I say, I'm in my early 60s now. Purely on the statistics, I've got less than 2 decades of life left. Maybe a bit more. I think the medical science is advanced. So I'm 58, so I always I named that I would live to 108, and I actually did that on my 4th birthday. You've got a more optimistic. Yeah, you've got a more optimistic one than I have then. Based on no particular science whatsoever. Yeah, but But yeah, there's a difference between going when you're going, I think, when you're young and going when you're old, maybe. Yeah. Although I'm sure a lot of young people watching this might go, we can't have Mars colonised by old white guys. They've caused enough problems already. Yeah. I have sympathy for that point of view. But if personally offered the opportunity to go to Mars, yeah, I would, I'd give it very serious consideration.
I have conversations frequently with my children who are in their early 20s, and sort of,
yeah,
I expect them to live to 120, and I expect my grandchildren to live to sort of 150.
Yeah.
Grandchildren that haven't even been born yet. So within that sort of time frame, there's a reasonable chance that my children will have the opportunity to go into space, whatever that means, whether that's a Virgin Galactic tourism venture or an actual moon landing or something like that, don't know. And my grandchildren, I would expect there's a fairly good chance that at least one of them, assuming I have grandchildren, will actually get off planet. It's all within a time frame that is worth considering now, 20, 30 years.
I was joking with some friends recently. I haven't got any grandchildren yet either, but who knows whether I will or not. No pressure on my kids. But I was saying I could imagine that sort of when I'm old and almost senile and being pushed around in a wheelchair, we go, oh, I was almost an astronaut once. And they'll go, oh, not again. Oh, for somebody take him on a day trip, will you? Just so that, because it won't mean anything, because there'll be so many astronauts. It'll be like saying, I was almost a bus driver once, or, go, yeah, take him on a bus. And so he's quiet. There you go, Granddad. You've been to space. You can stop talking about it now.
Hey, it's been absolutely fabulous chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really look forward to having some other conversations and maybe meeting up sometime at one of the conventions or conferences, maybe now in not just virtual, but in real life.
Yeah, no, it would be absolutely great if we can manage that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Take care for now.
Okay. Take care, David. Bye for now.